Hello, and welcome to Breast Cancer Conversations, a podcast brought to you by SurvivingBreastCancer.org. I am Laura Carfing, breast cancer survivor and founder of SurvivingBreastCancer.org, a nonprofit organization providing community, education, and resources to empower those diagnosed with breast cancer and their caregivers from day one and beyond. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Breast Cancer Conversations. I am so thrilled you are joining us today. If you are new to our podcast, a huge welcome to you. We are so glad you're here and you're joining an amazing community of survivors, thrivers, previvors, and friends, most importantly. If you're not familiar, please hop on over to survivingbreastcancer.org/events. That is where you're going to find all of our services and programs, especially our signature Thursday Night Thrivers meetup, where we meet up every Thursday night at 7 p.m. Eastern for our no agenda, just hang out on Zoom. Come as you are, all are welcome. We also have our Movement Mondays, anywhere ranging from writing workshops to yoga, Pilates, breathing and meditation exercises, you name it. If it's movement, it's Mondays. We also have our Breast Cancer Book Club. We meet up once a month on the first Sunday of every month, and we read books that have absolutely nothing to do with breast cancer. So if you're looking for an amazing community and just a little bit of escapism, the Breast Cancer Book Club is where it's at. Today, we are thrilled to be speaking with Judy Pearson. She actually has so many titles and accomplishments, but what I want to highlight today is that she is the author of the book From Shadows to Life, a biography of the Cancer Survivorship Movement. She is also a 10-year triple-negative breast cancer survivor who is going to talk to us not only about her own diagnosis and flashback to 10 years ago of what a cancer diagnosis meant, but then we get into the nitty-gritty of the survivorship movement dating back to like the 60s and 70s, which I find just absolutely fascinating. This episode is educational, informative, and inspiring, so I hope you enjoy. Welcome to the conversation.
I'm Judy Pearson, although my book titles say Judith L. Pearson. And two reasons for that. One, because my ex-husband told me it would make me sound smarter if I used my full name as opposed to just Judy. And that's why he's the ex. And I am this year a 10-year survivor of triple-negative breast cancer.
Congratulations. That is huge, especially for triple negative. I know we're always counting milestones and everything as well. So
right.
To celebrate 10 years is a great milestone.
Pretty miraculous. Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So how did you discover your own diagnosis backing up 10 years ago?
Well, it was an interesting time in my life. I am the mother of two now grown sons, and they were also 10 years younger at the time, but they were both still adults then. I had gotten divorced from said ex-husband, moved across the country. I was living here in Phoenix, moved to a home I owned on Lake Michigan, and met the man of my dreams. We got married. We were celebrating newlywed life at the same time that my eldest son, I felt like my boys had finally just really gotten settled as young adults. And the younger one had just reconnected with a woman who is now his wife and the mother of their 4-year-old child. My older son, who was a career Air Force member, he just retired after 20 years, was also nicely settled in life, although he was about to deploy to Afghanistan. I had a mammogram and 2 months later found a lump in my cleavage. We were watching TV, my new husband and myself, my sweet David, and I was just scratching and I was like, ooh, what is this? And I asked him to feel it because men will feel your boobs if you ask them to. And there was this lump. When the diagnosis was made, and quite honestly, the radiologist knew what it was because she kept saying to me, listen to me, this is very serious. I also became educated in dense breast tissue. At the time, and it still is the case, radiologists must notify patients, even with the happygram letter, if they have dense tissue. And it's a state-by-state law. So if you are in a state where that law has not been passed and you don't see anything further about that and you ask if there's dense tissue in your report, if it is, you need further diagnostics because mammography can't see through dense tissue. And ironically, it's not the women with larger breasts, because mine were not and still are not. It's just the type of tissue. It has nothing to do with the size.
Right, right. And I think that's such a good point to dwell on because, I think it's important to also let our listeners know dense tissue isn't something that you can feel,
Right.
correct? So, it is really through the mammography screening that they'll be able to tell whether or not you have dense tissue.
Right. So, and if you do have dense tissue, and even if it is marked on your mammography report, that's your signal to request an ultrasound follow-up, because ultrasound can detect what's there. And after my mastectomy, they discovered 3 more tumors in my breast that were buried fairly deeply. So if that one lone guy hadn't been palpable, by the time the others would have been, my cancer would have been very advanced. And in fact, my mother's sister died of metastasized triple negative disease, 2000, I think it was, or 2002, I guess. But in any event, I do not carry the BRCA mutations or any other genetic mutations of those that we know about right now. Clearly, I was supposed to survive this, and that if that was indeed the case, I promised God that I would do whatever He led me to do, and just sat around waiting to hear what that might be. And it didn't take long.
Yeah, very patiently too, sure.
Yes. Yes.
So, did you always know that you were going to go and have the mastectomy, or was a lumpectomy an option for you based on where the tumor was?
I had a love-hate relationship with my breast surgeon. We're both very strong personalities, as most women, or most people, men or women, who have never had a cancer experience. I was completely ignorant of what it all meant and what it all was. My surgeon said to me, well, and of course, this was before they had done the surgery to see these other tumors. Although I think maybe by that time they had seen some others, but in any event, she said she was concerned about taking a fairly good sized chunk, what that would leave me looking like. Sure. Probably like, I don't know, an apple with a big bite out of it, I guess. And so she said, I really think a mastectomy is in order. And at this point I was like, get it off. I don't care. Just do whatever you need to do. My disappointment in myself was not pushing for a double mastectomy. And every time I say that, I think my good boob is going to go rogue on me. I'm glad you're there. Because I said, well, I'm only going to do this once, so let's just take them both. And she said, oh, I hate to take a perfectly good breast. And wouldn't you know it, I've had like 4 biopsies on that side in the 10 years, just because they see something, they want to biopsy it. And I just keep thinking, oh man, this really should have happened. So, and I really, the biopsies don't happen right away. And apparently there's a whole insurance thing that if you don't do the second mastectomy within a given time, insurance doesn't cover it. I don't know. There's probably more people will probably email you and say, let me tell this lady what to do.
And that's why we share our voice. We're like, here's my situation. This is what's going on. If someone help. Yeah. But that's interesting. I'll have to look into some of the insurance around that. So that's really
right. And it's kind of in for a penny, in for a pound. I mean, if you're having one breast removed, and my reconstruction is elegant. It was beautiful. It was seamless. I've heard so many horror stories in the 10 years. I also asked my surgeon about, by this time I had done considerable research about nipple sparing. And she said, nope, I don't like to do that. I don't want cancer cells hiding anywhere. And I don't know if that was specific to my triple negative or just her preference. We just kind of went down that road. And I didn't realize they were very, very careful in diagnostics to make sure that it hadn't gone elsewhere. So I was scanned every which way from Sunday, which delayed to me my surgery. I was diagnosed on April 8th and the surgery was May 25th. So it was like, it felt like an eon before I actually had the surgery.
Sure.
And it really wasn't. It was just, I kept it was like Pac-Man. I could just see it like marching through my body.
Right. Well, once you know that you have been diagnosed with cancer, exactly what you said, get it out of me. Like, let's march down to the surgery room right now, if I could, right?
Give me
And
a
so,
scalpel.
and that's really interesting that you also speak about, the other breast and having to go through the biopsies. I feel like it's kind of like that catch-22 where, it's nice to have healthy tissue and a healthy breast. And I understand why they would advocate for keeping that. But then the scare, the anxiety, and the mental health that goes with every time you're going in for a mammogram, how that manifests itself with the waiting period and hopefully getting the benign.
Well,
Results.
and quite honestly, it isn't the surgery that I worry about at all. The surgery was for me fairly easy. I don't want to go through the chemo again, which I realize is necessary, but and we've made leaps and bounds since 10 years ago, but it was horrible. It was really, really awful. And as I always say, cancer doesn't end when treatment does. So no matter what your treatment is, there's always fallout, whether it's psychological, physical, or a combination.
Yes. And I definitely want to dig into that a little bit more too. But inquiring minds have to know because you were raving about your successful surgery. So I love to also highlight, I feel like these are things on like the Yelp reviews. You see all the negative pictures, you hear all the negative reviews about what could go wrong. And trust me, things do go wrong. But I would love to hear what type of reconstruction did you end up opting for?
I didn't know very many people in my circle of friends who had had breast cancer. My aunt, who had died, lived in Minneapolis and was considerably older than I was, obviously. So, but as it happened, I started a women's networking group, and in this town that I moved back to, and one of the gals in the group had just gone through breast cancer treatment. So I called her, and her dream team became my dream team. The plastic surgeon who did the reconstruction, once we made sure that the cancer was not in my rib cage or further in my chest wall, they put an expander in, and it was a relatively new type of expander that could remain as my implant, and it has. And
wow.
eventually, I'm sure it'll have to be changed out. But, it's 10 years and still ticking. And the expansion was not all that uncomfortable either, I have to say. So, but the scar is what's most remarkable, I think, is in that it's so now almost invisible, but it's a very, very thin line. So as I say to people, it just looks like my boobs are winking. There's one eye open and the other one's closed.
Sure. Very nice. Good optimism there as well.
Yeah.
And so you were speaking about the chemotherapy, and tell me a little bit about that. Do you recall the types of chemo drugs that you were on?
Yes. So the Red Devil, adriamycin,
yes.
which we learned, I don't know the exact year, but it was even before my treatment, that there is a lifetime limit of that because it causes severe cardiac implications. So as with this was a big part of the research for my most recent book, as with many of the treatments that are discovered, the medical community understandably gets really excited about them. And so kind of goes, well, if a little's good, more would be better. And so women and men too, because it was not only used for breast cancer treatment, but it was also used for Hodgkin's lymphoma treatment. Those folks early on were way overtreated with it. Cisplatin was the second drug, which a really interesting side note, cisplatin was mistakenly discovered at my alma mater, Michigan State University, totally by accident, which is mistaken. That was redundant. He was a bioengineer, but he was not doing cancer research. And Dr. Bernard Rosenberg, he left some platinum wires in a tank where he was growing cells, went to lunch, came back, and all the cells were dead. And so that was in 1965. They started doing treatment with, at the various levels. And in 1973, the drug was approved for human use.
Wow.
And the money that Michigan State, so when an entity, be it a university or an organization, and probably even an individual, when you discover something that is ultimately approved for human use by the FDA, you file a patent for it and you get money for that. So Michigan State received $3 million, which in today's money is probably about $500 million. Just about, I think. That money seeded the Michigan State Foundation, which has gone on to fund lots more research. So it's incredible. really very cool. Yeah,
yes.
really very cool.
Great.
And then my third drug was Taxotere. So the triple negative girls get ACT, it's called. So that was the third one. And the adriamycin went first. I had that first, and that was the one that really, oh man, it really took a lot out of me. The next two were not so bad, although cisplatin causes quite a bit of nausea. Cisplatin has been modified, so it's less harsh now, but it was the first metal-based cancer drug and the workhorse for chemotherapies for lots of cancers. It was originally for testicular cancer, and then they found it worked in breast cancer.
Wow. Incredible. And were you given any recommendations on like how to combat the nausea or any of the other side effects when you were going through this?
Well, I have an allergy to compazine, which is the go-to anti-nausea drug. But so I had to use a different one of those. But I carefully researched the disease, my type of disease, the treatment, read all the blog posts, do this, do that. Yeah. I had a mountain of preparation, a lot of which I never used. I can't remember why there were frozen rice bags. I don't know what that was all about, but I had frozen rice bags. And really it was interesting. My weight loss, which we all experience, didn't come from excessive nausea. I was typically sick, 36 hours after a treatment, and it would last about 36 hours. But the weight loss came just from a lack of appetite.
Yeah.
All I wanted was protein shakes and grapefruit.
Did you lose your taste buds? That's one of the side effects that happened to me, actually.
My taste?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Did you say no? I did not.
Oh, okay. Well, that's good. I lost my taste buds going through my chemotherapy. I was on five or six different drugs at the time. And that was devastating to me because, I like food, face it, right? Okay. And then all of a sudden, I just remember like one time I couldn't taste the peanut butter. And I was like, do I need more peanut butter on my toast? Like, I literally can't taste this. And then it got to the point, speaking of like weight loss, I think some of us experience weight gain from all of the steroids that we're on from the chemotherapies, but then the weight loss countering that because you're just like, I have no appetite for anything. Nothing tastes good. Yeah. And so, luckily they came back. The taste buds did come back, but it was a very surreal experience. And so now when we're in the midst of COVID, I like totally relate to people when they talk about losing their sense of taste.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And it's interesting too, that you speak about these like longer term lingering effects. And I wholeheartedly agree that, no one, and maybe rightly so, they don't tell you when you're diagnosed with cancer that this is really going to change the rest of your life for the rest of your life. Because, hearing the words you have cancer is hard enough. But I don't think I realized, I'm approaching 5 years out, you're 10 years out, and I'm still coming to terms with everything that I'm going through. And it's so funny you mentioned the cardiac disease, because I actually have an appointment coming up with a cardio oncologist to talk about my heart health. And you're like, are you kidding me? Like just one more thing. And so
that has lots of implications. So, first of all, yes, they still don't. There was a time when doctors didn't even divulge a diagnosis to a patient. Patients were just told that they had a growth or a malignancy or a condition. And part of that was due to the fact that it was worse news then than it is now, because there was nothing to be done. Whatever you had, they could take body parts out or off. But if you had a blood cancer, that's not going to work. And they had some cobalt radiation, which was horribly harsh. And so there was really nothing to be done about it. The doctors and the nurses were not trained in any kind of psychosocial skills for how to deal with this. So basically, we're saying to a patient, and you're going to die. So there was that. And then secondly, cancer, and I'm talking really almost as recently as the 80s, cancer was thought to be contagious. It might have been self-induced in some way. It became a stigma from which not only the patient was not going to recover in that regard, but their families weren't either. I mean, now that we've been through this pandemic and everybody's wigged out about contagion has always existed. And humankind learned that the deadliest diseases were the contagious ones, the Black Plague, tuberculosis, polio, you name it. So why wouldn't cancer fall into that same thing? Because cancer killed people. So therefore it must be contagious. So we started treating people for cancer without thinking of any of those things. And it's been a very long time, and it still is in some cases, the status to just simply, you ring the bell in the chemo corridors, you get your cupcake and your balloons, and you go home. The interesting analogy is that if you suffer a heart attack, like as soon as you're conscious, or if you've never lost consciousness, your medical team is telling you how they're going to rehab you, how you're going to have to maybe make some lifestyle changes, smoke less, drink less, eat less, whatever might be pertinent to you. They're already preparing you. And sometimes you have to have occupational therapy and what's the other one? Occupational and
like physical therapy, the PT.
Physical therapy, yep. Yeah, and learning how to redo things. They're telling you about that, and they're walking you around the halls and pumping your ears full of that. Doesn't exist with cancer, and oftentimes still doesn't.
That's a great analogy. I'm thinking now, like, wow, how helpful would that be if we have those conversations about, maybe speak with a nutritionist, because, you're going to be on these harsh treatments, and we want to talk about diet and exercise and movement. And to your point with all of the history, which I want to talk a little bit more about too, is right. Like you think about back in the day when you got diagnosed with breast cancer or any cancer, it was stay home, rest. We hope you get better, but you're probably going to die. To where you are now, where it's like, okay, you've been diagnosed with breast cancer. Try and walk as much as you can. Try and get some physical movement as much as you can. Like, right. This idea that
move your arm, stretch the muscle.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's like we went 180 to the philosophy of how we're coaching and advising patients.
Right. But it's the, so there's a wonderful book, a Pulitzer Prize winner, in fact, written by Dr. Siddhartha Mukherjee, called The Emperor of All Maladies. It's a biography of cancer. And it's a tremendous book, and it is very non-medical person friendly. I read it because I thought, well, I'm volunteering and I'm doing all this stuff. I should really learn more about the disease in general. I couldn't put it down. It was fabulous. So while I was writing From Shadows to Life, I realized that if cancer is the emperor of all maladies, then the emperor rules over 4 realms. So first, there's the realm of cure. That was the first thing we wanted to do. Again, we tried to cure things throughout history. And so we're going to cure cancer. And then absent that, the second realm, if we can't cure it, we're going to learn how to treat it better. So that was the second realm. The third realm then all of a sudden became prevention. Oh, things might cause cancer. Smoking, water and air pollution, maybe bad eating habits or other health habits. So we can actually prevent it. But the fourth realm is the realm that's still populated by the shadow people. It's the realm that's forgotten or not even known about unless you've been through cancer or had a loved one go through it. And that's the realm of survivorship. And it fell to the survivors to begin the conversation about survivorship. And that was the birth of the survivorship movement.
It's amazing how you have to go to the people who are experiencing it to influence change.
Yeah.
We were just talking about this recently with regards to metastatic breast cancer and all of the advocacy work that is going to try and increase research dollars to fund research for metastatic disease. And similar to what you were saying with that first realm of, if we can cure this, if we can start at the top with the people who are dying and come up with, first understand why it is progressing and come up with a cure, everybody else will reap the benefits of that.
That's right.
And we have the NBC community working side by side with our quote unquote like early stagers to really try and make a difference. But why is it falling on them or us, so to speak, versus everyone else? So to your point, I completely wholeheartedly resonate with that. And I think that's a beautiful segue to talk about, what is survivorship? What is this movement? And what does that mean? How do you define it?
35 years ago, the way the numbers all lined up is really pretty amazing. So 35 years ago, 23 people came together in October in Albuquerque, New Mexico, to discuss the possibility of creating, at that time they called it a network about cancer survivorship. They were all related to cancer in one form or another. Either they were survivors, or they were survivors and had started organizations, or maybe not survivors but started organizations. They were doctors. There was a nurse. There was an attorney who was working. This was in 1986. There was an attorney who was working on some pro bono discrimination cases that cancer survivors had filed. So they just came from all walks of life. And the fact that they came from everywhere in the country to Albuquerque, which is a lovely city, but not exactly the mecca you would go to for this kind of a meeting. I mean, you would think New York, Chicago, somewhere in California,
Sure.
But Albuquerque spoke volumes to the need for this whole thing. The two organizers were a woman who had survived cervical cancer and had started an organization for all cancer survivors. And the term cancer survivor, didn't really exist even in the vocabulary at that time. The media insisted on calling them cancer victims, which I just can't think of anything worse. And even if you were like me 10 years out, I'd still be a cancer victim. She was deceased when I wrote this, but had already died when I wrote this book. Catherine was like a dog with a bone. She wasn't giving it up. He is Dr. Fitzhugh Mullen. He was a very prolific writer, a very good writer, and found a massive tumor in his chest himself, just taking a random chest x-ray because he had had a cough. And his surgery might have gone well, except it didn't. It went horribly badly, not because of the cancer, but because his valve was nicked and he started bleeding out. And his book about surviving that is amazing. But I tell that story in my book as well. So the two of them were the organizers, and Catherine lived in Albuquerque, and Fitz had actually been in the public health department or public health service and lived in Santa Fe. So it just kind of made sense that they would meet in Albuquerque. And they created the definition for survivorship. That was one of their big goals for the weekend. It begins, they said, at the moment of diagnosis, because that's when you start surviving cancer. And Fitz talked about a time that he was on a speaking tour after he'd written his book about finding his own cancer called Vital Signs. And he was in the vestibule outside the room where he just spoken, and this woman came running up to him, and she had a bandana on and she had no eyebrows. She was clearly either still in treatment or just at the end of it. And she was looking around furtively, and she said, "I'm really not supposed to be here. I'm not where you are. I'm not a survivor." And he said to me, I thought, this is crazy. people get this god-awful diagnosis. They go through hellacious treatments, and then they don't get to call themselves survivors until some magical moving goal line. It's 3 years for this one and 5 years for that one. And what if you make it to that 5-year mark and the next day you get another diagnosis? Your cancer recurs, or it's a secondary cancer. Does that mean you didn't survive the first one? So they said, no, it starts at the moment of diagnosis and goes through the balance of life. So whether you are metastatic, stage 4, a newbie, doesn't matter where you are a survivor. And that's harder for those who are still in some form of treatment. It's harder for them to wrap their minds around. So it's easier if you just think, well, even after the acute treatment is over, even after you are in ongoing treatment, you've survived until that moment. And that's important.
Exactly. I think that's really important. I love the definition of from the moment of diagnosis.
Yeah.
Because, a lot of times, I don't know why we've created these arbitrary dates, these arbitrary milestones, last day of chemo, last day of radiation, or if you're terminal, there is no last day, but you are surviving. You are part of the nomenclature of survivor. Exactly. And I think, that's why I'm so excited to have you on the podcast, because when I was coming up with the name of our nonprofit, survivingbreastcancer.org, it was that active action word of surviving. That is what we are doing. We are here. We have a voice. We are living, regardless of the stage and the diagnosis. We're here now. And I think that's in and of itself is really empowering. So I'm happy to hear.
Yep. Absolutely.
So tell me when did you start ruminating about this idea for the book? How did that come to fruition?
Well, so I, like so many other people, I had a very successful business life. I had written 2 biographies about ordinary people who were extraordinarily courageous during World War II. The second one was purchased for a movie. And because they were both courageous, and one was a man and the other was a woman, and they were courageous in different ways, I got the idea that courage is different for the genders. And so I had a speaking gig. I spoke all over the country on the subject of women's courage and how it differs from men's courage and why that's important to know. So I was hired by organizations for their annual meetings to present something, whether they were dentists or engineers or computer gurus, whatever they were. I was the non-topic, kind of fun, hopefully interesting speaker. And then this all came to a screeching halt because, of course, you can't jump on an airplane and travel around the country doing this, nor can you concentrate on writing a book because you have chemo brain. And so even after my diagnosis or after my treatment was ended, I just thought I couldn't wrap my mind around the next story to tell. So I wrote a small book that was meant to be inspirational, 20 essential life lessons that I had learned and going through treatment. And I was going to sell the book for some kind of a fundraiser. Didn't know what. And then I found an organization that I liked the sound of. It was a women's survivors organization. So I volunteered for them for a couple of years. And then we came back to Phoenix. And while I was volunteering for this other organization and meeting all these women who were doing amazing things in their survivorship, I thought, wow, they're taking the focus off themselves. They're shining their energies out to the world. And they're really happy. And then I was looking back at some research I was doing for a book I was going to write about courage. And one of the chapters, ironically, was going to be courage in the face of catastrophic illness. And I had found this data that had been compiled about the health benefits of volunteering, physical benefits. It makes you feel better about yourself and your situation. And that in turn releases all these feel-good hormones like oxytocin, and you get this helper's high. And so pretty soon, whatever is troubling you in your life, doesn't go away, but it sort of takes a back seat. And I was like, wow, so there's healing and helping. This is interesting. So I started an organization here in Phoenix called asecondact.org. And our sole purpose is to support and celebrate women who are giving back to the greater good. Our fundraiser is a storytelling event, and a live storytelling event on stage with a cast of 8 women who have auditioned to be a part of the cast. And the money we raise, so it changes every year, money we raise allows us to do a variety of things, supporting women who have either launched or want to launch a second act, including micro grants. Women apply each year. Our advisory board reads the grants, makes their decisions, and then we give these $1,000 micro grants for the sole purpose of growing or launching your second act. There's lots of organizations who do other kinds of support and who do other kinds of grants. We're pretty rifle specific. And in the process of growing second act here in Arizona, I met this amazing woman called Susie Lay, who lives in Tucson, who was the nurse who went to that original meeting of that became the birth of the survivorship movement. And she is a, almost 50-year survivor of Hodgkin's lymphoma. She has had 3 other diagnoses, and she has cardiac issues as a result of being overtreated early on from radiation. But she is just the most amazing and wonderful woman. And when I started speaking with her and she started talking about survivorship, I was like, wow, this is so cool. So originally my book was going to be just about her. And she's very, despite the amazing work she's done in her career, she is very shy about taking any credit and insisted that if there was to be a book, it had to be all of them. So I talk about all of them, but I follow 5. And, as some, their careers went different directions, other people stepped up to keep the movement going. And they patterned the movement after the AIDS movement, which was relatively new at the time in 1986. And the fact that there were survivors at all. So here's the other really quirky number thing that works. 50 years ago, on December 23rd, 1971, President Richard Nixon signed the National Cancer Act. He really did it to be reelected, which worked. He was reelected, but he was drowning in bad news. He had an unwinnable war in Vietnam, which he had promised to end. That wasn't happening. And meanwhile, Congress, this bill was churning through Congress. And so his aides came to him and said, you can get reelected. Shoot, we can even throw in that we will cure cancer by the bicentennial. Just sign this bill. Well, by the bicentennial, all we remembered about President Nixon was the impeachment and the disgrace and all of that. But the $1.8 billion, which is $8.5 billion today, that money that was funneled into research turned the tide on survivorship. The treatments and the drugs like cisplatin, those were all in the process, and that really got accelerated because of President Nixon's National Cancer Act.
Wow. Incredible chain of events. And sometimes we don't really know where those events are going to take us, where we land up with them. And the butterfly effect, you do one thing now and, across the world, something else is happening. 50 years later, this is what we're experiencing.
Exactly.
Amazing. Well, how can our listeners learn more about you and where to order your book and get more information?
The book is available as in hard copy, and it's a paperback, but I mean a hard copy and ebook on Amazon.com. The title is From Shadows to Life, a biography of the Cancer Survivorship Movement. The prologue is available on my website, Judith L. Pearson, Pearson.com. I am always happy to talk about the survivorship movement. And one thing I do also want to stress, you know how sometimes people say, well, the government should do this and the government should do that. In fact, I think we say that a lot these days. So my answer is always, well, we are the government. This is true in the survivorship movement as well. Those who began it are now later in life, longer in tooth. We are the survivorship movement. It is up to us as survivors today to continue the movement, which will continue to improve survivors' lives 5 and 10 and 15 years down the road. You know, it used to be you couldn't get insurance if you had cancer. You couldn't get a job. You could be fired if you disclosed a cancer diagnosis. The cancer survivorship movement is the reason those laws have been changed. So it's up to us to continue advocating, whether it be for ourselves, for someone else, or on a global stage like you're doing with your podcast and the organization.
Thank you. Incredible. Judy,
Wonderful.
This has been so educational and inspirational. I'm sitting on this end smiling. I know people can't see it, but this is just so amazing. And I appreciate the historical perspective, because I think a lot of times we get diagnosed with breast cancer. It's a whirlwind. And some of us do go. There's a lot of great training programs for like advocacy work, and, you know, Project Lead and different hospitals have their own survivorship programs as well. But then to have like a text and a hard copy, so to speak, of, you know, where did this movement really come from, and to understand the history of the language and the advocacy work that's happening and where we are today and how we can bring that forward, I really appreciate. Well, this has been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for taking the time tonight to speak with me and record. And yeah, we'll go from here.
Thank you so much. Be well. I look forward to meeting you in person.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. You too. Thank you for tuning in and listening to our podcast. If you would like to find out more about our organization and upcoming events and ways to connect, you can find out more by visiting our website at survivingbreastcancer.org. I would like to acknowledge that all of the information on our podcast is from personal experiences, and it is not a substitute for professional medical advice. You should always consult your medical care team. If you're looking for specific topics or would like to be a guest on our show, feel free to contact me directly at laura@survivingbreastcancer.org. And of course, we have a couple social media handles you can follow us at as well. For example, Surviving Breast Cancer Org, all one word, as well as our podcast specifically, Breast Cancer Conversations. Until next time, keep on thriving.